Alright, so this presentation is going to cover in pretty good detail everything you wanted to know about the BME 352 reverse engineering project, which is the one big project for this class this semester. And the presentation will start off with a basic uh, overall discussion of what reverse engineering is, and then after that I'll talk about all the details and the requirements for the different parts of the project that you're going to have to do later this semester. So what is reverse engineering? Reverse engineering is the process of discovering the technological principles of a device or object or system through analysis of its structure, function, and operation. In common usage in industry, reverse engineering often involves taking something apart and analyzing its workings in detail, usually with the intention to construct a new device, system, or program that does the same thing without actually copying anything from the original. In other cases, the objective is to be able to make an exact copy in every detail. It is interesting to realize that it is possible to reverse engineer almost any system. Even living systems or self-organizing systems that were not engineered in the first place, such as a mechanical device, an electronic component, a software program, a living cell or organism, or even a geologic structure. In this sense, reverse engineering is essentially science, using the scientific method as well as a measurement system and analysis and other tools to gain an understanding of the inner workings and overall function of a system or structure. The sciences such as biology and physics can be seen as the reverse engineering of living biological systems in the physical world respectively. Reverse engineering includes both black box and white box methods. In black box reverse engineering, the device is observed without examining the internal systems. Observations would include its capabilities, logic, and human interface. In white box reverse engineering, the internal components are examined in an effort to discover the technology of the device and how its interconnected systems operate to collect inputs and process the outputs. So you can really think of reverse engineering as looking at scientific phenomena. It could be anything, tangible, intangible, direct and indirect. It could be phenomena, physical materials, objects, and really what it is taking those observations and using it to get a better, more complete understanding of the inner workings of how those things occur in nature. And it could be both, man-made objects or things that occur naturally in nature. And a good example of what indirect observation would be is, even you can think of Albert Einstein looking at how time works in general. Even though there's really no direct observation of time, basically he was able to get a better understanding than what we had previously by looking at time dilation and that faster objects moving very fast relative to the speed of light actually experience a slowing down of time relative to other objects in space that are moving slower to it. And it's just an example of being able to break down something that you thought was intangible, really not knowing how it works, and using measurements, theoretical calculations, bringing that all together to really build up a piece-by-piece understanding of how something is occurring out in nature. So what are the goals of reverse engineering? There's three main ones. You want to know the structure, the function, and the operation of the device that you're looking at, or the phenomena in nature. What I mean by structure is that you want to look at what does the device look like on the outside, what are the buttons, what are the materials, how does a user interact with it. Then what I mean by internal is how does it take those external features and bring them together to process information and produce an output that's useful for the user. That's more of an engineering example with the device. But with the function of the device, you want to know, why does this device exist? Why was it built to begin with? Who was it intended to be purchased by? Is it a consumer product, or is it to be used by patients or care providers? You want to know why this device was even designed to begin with, and who is the person that's going to be using it. And so you got to know the purpose of why it's out there. So with the operation of the device, you want to know, how does it achieve its function? What is the physics behind it? What is the engineering, the electronics, the mechanics, all of these things? What principles is it using to process information and achieve its purpose that it was designed to do? So you might think that you want to take a medical device or any other product out there and reverse engineer it just for the purpose of getting an understanding and then recreating an exact copy on your own. But that's not always what you want to do with reverse engineering. Sometimes you want to take something in nature, whether it's like a cell culture, human tissue, or any other biological example, understand how it's performing its function and actually translate that technology or that understanding to another field of technology and build something on your own that's not really related to what you were first looking at. And that's just an example of how you can use reverse engineering and its information that it produces to improve technology in either the same field or apply it to something else and actually build something that's better than what's out there right now. And so basically you can use reverse engineering to either copy something or really improve upon it and build something that's better than what's already out there. So what are the values of reverse engineering? In industry, reverse engineering allows us to build upon current technology without copying. So if you're working in a company and you're not sure whether or not your design is the same as someone else's that's already out there, it'd probably be a good idea to get your hands on that device, open it up, look at the insides, the electronics, the mechanics, and see if the subsystems in those devices are actually similar to yours. And you want to know if your technology and the way that you're accomplishing it is not infringing on someone else's that's already out there. Another example is that sometimes you might want to know how much someone else was spending to produce their devices. So you'll probably get your hands on the competitor's device and make a list of all of the pieces that were used to make it and put up a list of a bill of materials to estimate the competitor's costs in producing their device. An interesting example that happened a few years was when the U.S. Navy SEALs had their raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. And during that raid, a helicopter crashed on the fence, or one of the helicopters did. And immediately after the crash, I guess the soldiers decided to blow up the helicopter. And they did that so that, I guess, enemies or the public in the area wouldn't discover that helicopter later and be able to look at the technology behind it and break it down and reverse engineer the stealth technology and the military technology contained inside that helicopter. And it was just an interesting example that happened in the media a few years ago of someone really trying to protect their technology and prevent others from reverse engineering their device or machinery. And it was really their helicopter overall. So sometimes the FDA has to recall a device because it's not performing its function properly, or it's resulting in patient injuries, or it's making outcomes in surgeries less successful. It could be many different examples, but when an FDA recalls a device, it's important for the manufacturers and maybe some other external party to reverse engineer the device, break it down, and try to figure out what's the real problem behind the technology that's causing the device not to perform to its specifications. And that's an example of where you might want to find why a device performed poorly or well using reverse engineering. Another example of when you might want to protect it that's not really military is like for software companies. Sometimes they'll hire, I guess, hackers to see if they can break down security barriers in networks or with software. And a lot of times these hackers can reverse engineer the software and the security systems, and that's how they can gain an advantage on everyone else using the same system. Another example is from the user's perspective for software is that if users are able to reverse engineer software or computer programs, they can use that software for purposes that it wasn't originally intended for by the manufacturers, or they can even use that reverse engineering knowledge to do illegal product duplication. One example where reverse engineering is it's really important is when you get a device or technology that has really bad documentation. There's like no notebooks or anything like that, and there's really nothing for you to work with. There's no electronic part, data sheets, or anything like that. So when you're in a situation where you really have a complete lack of written documentation, it's going to require you to use direct observation and get a hands-on approach to break down this device with reverse engineering. And that's how you're going to acquire all the missing details that are not documented and handed off to you. Sometimes you'll just be, handed a system without any context to it at all, and you're going to have to get your own understanding on it. So there's two main parts, a first half and a second half to reverse engineering. And the first half is the black box reverse engineering component. And what that means is black box, you're given a component or system and you don't know any of its internal workings, and you just have to build up an understanding based on the exterior of the system or the device and just see what its capabilities, logic, and human interfaces are. So that's just a complete external understanding of the technology without any understanding of what's going on inside the device. That's what I mean by black box reverse engineering. So once you have a good understanding of what the device looks like on the outside, you move into the next phase, which is the white box reverse engineering part. And that's when you really open up the device and examine in good detail all the internal electronic components inside of it. That's how you're going to understand the technology mostly. And when you first do this for this project, you're going to want to create some very high-level diagrams of how the black box reverse engineering parts, like the logic, the human interface, connects to the internal components that are found in the white box reverse engineering phase. And that's what I mean by map the inputs and outputs of the system. You want to be able to have a visualization of that information at the end of both of these phases. Alright, so I just talked about some of the basics of reverse engineering and what are some of the reasons behind us doing it. Now I'm going to focus on a lot of the details of the project that we're going to have this semester in BME 352. So last semester, the teams in the class took apart a blood pressure monitor, and there were two different devices. Some of these devices may be familiar from when you were sophomores in BME 204. Might be the same device actually. There were two different types used last year in the class. One blood pressure monitor device that had an automatic inflating cuff on the left, and the right was the same device, could perform the same functions, except that it had a manual pump that had to be pumped up by the person hooked up to the machine. So there were pretty much the same devices, just a slight difference in one of the features. So with the blood pressure monitor, you might remember from last year in the lab, you had to go into some of the theory about the different types of ways that blood pressure is monitored. And there's manual monitoring, there's automatic, there's the auditory method with the bell and drum. And with the automatic system, it uses a different technique, the auscultatory measurement of the Korotkoff sounds. And basically there's just a threshold that it waits for your blood moving through the vessels to get loud enough to a certain point, at which it reaches a threshold, and it starts measuring that as the systolic, the maximum blood pressure in your blood. And once it reduces to where it can't hear the sound again, that is the part where it's the diastolic blood measurement. And basically, you're going to have to talk about this theory again in some detail in the report that you write up this semester in the project. But what's important is when you get these devices on your teams, you don't want to just start taking the device apart and breaking it down. You actually want to keep it in working order for the beginning portion of the project, so that you can actually test the device on a few people, get a small data set to work with, and you can actually get an idea of some of the precision of the measurements of the device, but not really the accuracy, unless you're comparing it to another measurement technique that has a known blood pressure value on a specific patient. So really, I'm just looking for you to get an idea of the precision of these devices that are pretty much for take-home. They're not really meant for clinical use. So in general, it's a large class this year, but despite that, the teams are going to be composed of about 5 students for each team, and I'll choose that this week, so you guys will have your teams beginning next week, and you can start to work with them. But pretty much, once you have your team set, you're going to start to disassemble and analyze a piece of medical equipment. And for this year, again, it's going to be a blood pressure monitor, a commercially available one for consumers, not really for doctors and for clinical use. And you're going to take it apart, try to get a really good understanding of how it works on the outside, on the inside. But after you do that part of it, at the end, you're going to use this information to design an improvement to the device based on your understanding of who's using it and how it works. And hopefully you're going to design a feature that adds more value to the device, whether it gets better measurements or it has a new feature that's useful. You're going to come up with your own idea for this part of the project at the end. And at the end, you're going to write all this up in a summarized written report called a final deliverable. And it's an official document. And you'll have a lot of them next year as seniors, but this will be your first chance to get experience writing a deliverable document. And I'll talk a lot about that later on in this semester. So after you get your written report completed, we're going to move on to a design review, which is just each team presenting their findings, what they did, how they did it, what they came up with, and why they did it. And that's going to be towards the end of this semester. And usually these are just short presentations, 10 minutes or less. So it's not really a long presentation. You need to be concise and present your material in a way that's understandable to a large group of audience members. Maybe it's management in the company who doesn't have the technical background that you may have, or it might be you're giving a pitch presentation and the audience doesn't have the same understanding as you. This is going to be kind of an exercise in learning how to give a presentation that's technical, but be able to present it in a way that's understandable to a large range of audience members. And I'll announce the due dates for this soon in the coming weeks. So some of the purposes of this project, or the objectives of the project, are you're going to be assigned to a team of 5 or so, and this is going to be a professional team. You're going to treat it like you're working in industry, or you're working in a research laboratory. It's going to be a team, so we're going to try to introduce you to that environment. Some of the other things we're going to talk about is introducing you to the medical device industry and some of its practices. Quality systems check. We're also going to be talking about documentation and how controls are, held. Alright, so as I've emphasized in previous classes, the notebooks are really an important part of this class and the project as well. You want to document the entire process from the beginning, when you're first given the blood pressure monitor, to the disassembly of it, to the analysis of it, and up to the point where you're writing the report and giving the presentation. You want to keep your notebook up to date throughout the entire semester, and definitely throughout this project. So when you first get the device and you keep it in its working order, and you're doing tests, you want to document all the data, make tables, write down measurements, document who you were testing the device on, how many people were tested, and things like that. So you want to document it as if it were, an experiment in a laboratory, so that you have, pretty reliable data. If you do independent research outside of meetings and outside of class, if you look at websites and read reports on the devices, include the sources that you're reading and take notes on them, and make sure that you include enough information such that a reader of your notebook could find those sources that you were looking at. We also want to, put data sheets, attach other pages into the notebook with staples, glue, and things like that, and tape. It's a good idea to have the data sheets in there. If you don't know what a data sheet is, it's mostly for the electronic components, and I can show those in class if you're unsure about that. But there's a lot of parts inside of these devices. You want to include a few data sheets relevant to these devices inside of your notebook. So you're going to have a few meetings, hopefully several meetings with your team throughout this project. In each of these meetings, you want to document who was there, the date, title it, and all that stuff. But not everyone has to take the same meeting notes at the same meeting. Sometimes you might designate one of the team members to take notes for that meeting. The people who aren't taking notes at that meeting should designate or write in their notebook who that person was that was taking notes. Give their name, their contact info, and write the pages that someone can find those notes. So not everyone has to write the same notes at the meeting, but you can always designate at least one other person to do that. And the notebooks are turned in at the end of the class when the project is wrapped up this semester. So you're going to have all your project related notes in the notebooks, hopefully, with all the other notes that you've been taking in there. And that's going to be graded at the end of this project. So it's definitely important to keep these notebooks up to date. So to talk a little bit about the project setting in this class, you want to imagine that the group of 5 people that you're working with are part of a company, and they've been given this blood pressure monitor without any documentation associated with it, and they lack all understanding of how it was put together. And you want to treat it like whoever was giving you this stuff really didn't have any detailed notes or anything. They just had really poor records. And your goal is to take this device and have an evidence-based approach and try to build up a hands-on, experiential understanding of this device on your own and fill in all the missing information that should have been given to you in the first place. That's really what this project is all about. Once you get this understanding of how this device works, you're going to use that information to design hopefully a new and novel feature that gives it, improved performance and gives more value to the device for your company's objectives. So you're going to write this up in a report that's understandable for a large audience, a wide range of people maybe not with technical backgrounds like you have. So you want to make sure that the deliverables and the presentations that you turn in for this class are geared towards a wide range of audience members. Could be your management, could be people in other departments at your company, people that don't have the same technical experience. It's important that you understand who you're presenting to at all times, whether it's written reports or oral presentations. At all times, you want to understand the audience. So you want to write your report and in such a way that anyone reading it without your background can get enough of an understanding to replicate exactly what you're talking about on their own. That's really the goal of the written report. And to do that, there's a flow chart of steps that you need to follow to be able to have that success with the written report and convey enough information. And it really starts with the notebook. You want to take as much notes as possible throughout the entire semester. The more notes, the better. And throw in all the information you can. It will make it a lot easier at the deliverable stage when you start to write stuff up. Because basically when you get to the deliverable stage, all you're doing is translating the useful part of your notes into an official document. And you're just going to be cutting down all the unnecessary stuff that you've already written in the notebook. So basically, your deliverable has already been written. You just have to reorganize it in a formal document, which is the deliverable. You're just cutting stuff down. So the more notes you take, the better it is at the deliverable writing stage. And at the deliverable writing stage, you're including all that useful information and conveying it in a way that's understandable to someone such that they could replicate it completely on their own and have their own physical realization of the device. Alright, so there's a lot of different details you want to have in the report, and I've written up an entire rubric just to cover really the fundamental, essential parts that you have to have in your deliverable to be successful in this. And I'll present that later on in the course. I'll post it on the online page. But really what that's doing is giving you kind of like a formula of the pieces you need to have that success and have someone read your document and be able to recreate exactly what you're talking about in a physical form. So some of the requirements of the device include doing a 3D modeling of it in SolidWorks. I know you've had some experience in the past in some other courses with SolidWorks and doing some simpler renderings, but in this class you want to be able to take an object that's already out there and create a very realistic physical rendering of it or digital rendering of it in SolidWorks. And that's one of the goals of this class. And you'll do that with the device you're originally given, and you'll also render it again with the new feature added onto it later on at the end of the project. You also want to have an understanding of the clinical application of the device. You want to state whether or not this device is precise enough, or does it have the potential to be accurate enough to be used in a clinical setting. You want to know the target market and the users of the device and the environment that it's used in. Is this a home device? Is it for consumers? What type of situations is it used in? To do that, you'll have to do a little bit of background research, probably on the internet or other sources, or even use your early stage experimental data to back up some of your claims for this part of it. And throughout the whole process, you want to be taking pictures, creating visual tools to help guide someone through this, whether it's in an oral presentation and definitely in the report. When you're taking this apart, in the early stages, document, step by step, exactly what you did, what tools you used, label all the components, because just reading it alone is not going to give enough information to someone to be able to recreate it on their own. You want to include all the visualizations of it, of the steps you took, to give someone, all the information that they need possible. So definitely take a lot of pictures and include them in your documents that you turn in for this class, and definitely for the presentation. So some of the other deliverable requirements involve creating block diagrams of the inputs and outputs, and the sensors used to receive the information and take it in. Major components, subsystems, and logic used. And that, ties together the black box part, which is the outside understanding of the device, to the white box part is when you understand what's going on inside. You want to have some flowcharts, block diagrams tying all these pieces together. What are the users input into the machine? What does it do with these inputs, and how does it get that information back to the user, and how does it, perform its function? You want to have visual tools that you create on your own, and you can do that in PowerPoint and other tools, and you want to have these in your documents. You want to describe the tests performed on the working device. If you're going to be taking measurements on people, describe how many measurements were taken. You want to set it up in your notebook in a formal way. You want to talk about the valuable features and deficits of the device. If you realize that there's some clever things that are implemented in this technology, state that. And then if you see some parts of the technology that could really use a lot of improvement, document that in your notebook too, and say why you see that. What's the reason behind it? You want to recommend modifications to be made to the device before we sell it under our own label. So at the end, when you find a new feature that's going to be useful and add value to the device, you want to be able to justify why you're adding that. And to do that, you're going to have to probably understand the users of the device and what type of expectations these users have of the device. Do they expect it to be really accurate? How reliable is this? You want to be able to use data, maybe other sources, to justify you coming up with this new feature and adding it to the device for your company and your team. To continue talking about some of the other requirements, you want to include a 3D view of the original and the redesigned device, again, to emphasize that point. You also want to have a bill of materials, which you'll probably have that farther along at the end of the project. But throughout the whole project, you want to keep track of all the parts, all the materials that were used to build this device. And I'll show an example of that later in this presentation. And you want to include a complete bibliography with formal citations in your final deliverable. Whenever you use another source, or you talk to other people, or you use the instruction manual, you refer to data sheets, companies, suppliers. Whenever you use outside information, always include the source that you found that information, and make sure that you include enough identifying information in that source such that the reader can find that document or that source of information that you're relying on. So I've broken this project down into really 5 main phases that you can kind of think of it as being made up of. First, the initial research is the first stage of this project. You get all that information about the target users, who's this device designed for, what type of environments and situations is it used for, does it monitor specifically any health conditions that are serious that the user is interested in learning about. The next phase after that is the black box engineering, and I've already described that a little bit. You look at the outside of the device, look at all the inputs, what does the user work with, someone who purchases, what inputs do they give to the device, both physical and numerical inputs. After that, you want to open up the device, and at first you want to use non-destructive techniques. You don't want to start taking things apart and destroying things at first. What you really want to do is, be patient and have a methodical, step-by-step process where you take the device apart in such a way that, you don't rush into it too far and you overlook something. And with the white box engineering, you're trying to look at the electronics, the pumps, the mechanical parts of it, all the insides of the device. That's what the white box is about. After that, Once you have that understanding of how this thing works, both inside and out, you want to use that information to justify adding a new design feature that improves upon the current device, something that adds value to it. You want to be able to justify that, and it should be easy to do based on all the previous information you provide in the report, which is the final stage of these 5 stages, and that's the written deliverable. So to talk about this first initial stage, we'll start off with that discussion. And first you're going to perform the background research about what you're working with. Provide the manufacturer, the part number, the device number. You want to include all that information so we know actually what you're talking about to begin with. So we'll definitely, on day 1, put that in your notebook. Record the information in your notebooks for eventual transfer to the deliverable. And I've already emphasized that a lot this presentation already. Be sure to cite all the sources you use, whether it's the web pages you go out and look at, which it's perfectly fine to go out and use the internet for this project. That's definitely encouraged. If you refer to the maintenance manuals, operating manuals, technical manuals, always cite all these manuals that you refer to. So to research the users and the environment, who's the intended user, when and where is it used, what do the users expect to get from the device, how reliable is it, how many are sold each year, is it a popular device, how long has it been available on the market. All these are kind of interesting questions that someone reading your document will probably want to know to give some context to the situation and understand the purpose behind this whole project. So I'll talk about some of the other research questions that you want to consider. Identify the device. What's the physical description of it? What does it look like? The size, the dimensions. You want to include scale bars and all of that maybe in your pictures and definitely in your 3D SolidWorks renderings. Always have scale bars. And that's for the physical description of it. What materials makes up this device? Plastics, you want to try to get an idea maybe. Identify the specific plastic that's used. If there's PCB circuits, include all of these materials inside of this document. What are the device's primary functions? What are the clinical applications? How does it assist the final user? And if you take away some of the functions, if there's some malfunctions, at what point does the device become completely useless? And that's important to identify too. And you can write that in your block diagrams that you put into your reports and in your presentation. And does this device have any closed loop features? And what I mean by that is if it takes an input, processes that information, and makes a decision based on that information on the inside of the device, can the device use that to modify how it's taking in future measurements and try to do some self-correction in case something is going wrong? Is there a way for the device to know that and make changes to the way that it's operating? That's an important thing to identify too, and you want to write that in your report. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the next phase, which is the black box engineering portion. So you want to begin your project with observations and using non-destructive methods of reverse engineering. So don't take a drill and start drilling through the plastics and cracking stuff up, because you might want to backtrack at some point and you want to be patient. So don't jump in too far with this process. You want to be non-destructive in your approach at the beginning. That means basically you could put the device back together and have it functioning again. You want to learn everything you can about the form and function of the user interface. So not only looking at the physical components on the outside, what are some of the digital inputs to the device, whether it's LCD screens, buttons. You also want to be mindful of those features as well. So take photos of the exterior and all the inputs of the device, and also take pictures of the outputs. How does it get that information back out to the user? And that's really the value of the whole device to begin with. And at this point, you even want to start developing a draft of your bill of materials. So specifically talking about the device's exterior, you want to know and document, how is the device powered up? Is it with battery? Is it plugged into the wall? What are the power requirements of the device? Where is the on and off switch? And when would you want to turn it on and off? Does it turn on and off on its own? Things like that. You want to have a good detailed documentation of this. And you also want to know, can a user determine the power state of the device? Like, does it have indications of how much power is left? Does it need to be charged up? When does it need to be plugged in? Does it give the user any information about that aspect of the device? And this information about the power requirements and how it receives its power, whether it's battery or plugged in, gives you an idea about the intended users and settings that the device is going to be used in. If it's portable or not, is it intended to be used in a hospital? All these are clues that can help build up that understanding of about who this device was actually supposed to be used by. So here's an example from a project from a couple years ago of a hospital temperature monitor. And this is the black box engineering portion. They took a lot more pictures in this, but this was a pretty high level picture that showed overall the system before it was taken apart. And it shows, the whole layout of all the components of the system. And the report actually didn't label it, but you're going to want to do that. So I put arrows on top of this. You want to label every single portion of the device and all the other features of it and all the parts of the entire system that it makes it up. You want to label everything. So don't forget to include labels, figure numbers, captions, and titles. All of those are pretty important things. So these are some of the black box questions that you want to consider at this part. How are the functions accessed by the user? What are the physical inputs, buttons, numeric keypads, switches? What are the ranges of the inputs? What is the range of data that the machine can take in? Does it have limits? How is the data accessed by the device? How does it process that information? And that's just based on what you can see on the outside. You don't want to be opening up the machine yet. What information does the user receive from the device? How does the device convey that information back to the user? Is it visual? Is it physical feedback? How does it give that information back to the user? And you can see that without knowing anything about what's going on in the inside of the device. What human senses are used to receive the information? Is it visual, auditory, physical touch? Is it temperature? It could be any of these senses, but you want to state how does the user receive that information? And what is the logic with the human interface? Is there any logical sequence of events that the user should be able to pick up on their own to get that information out of the device? You want to document that with flowcharts and block diagrams. So by the time you reach this part of the project, you'll have an understanding probably of what the device looks like on the outside, all the inputs, and you'll know the outputs. And at this point, you'll be able to put together a pretty high-level block diagram or flowchart showing how inputs are taken in by whether it's a processor or the device as a whole, and takes those inputs and translates them to the outputs on the right side of this diagram. And how does it convert those measured values? Does it put them into auditory feedback, LCD displays, and things of that nature? This is just a very generic example, not really relating too much to this device that you'll be working with, but once you get your device, you want to make a specific input-output diagram based on all the inputs and all the outputs, all the useful information that goes back to the user. Alright, so moving on to phase 3 of the project, which is the white box engineering. You want to start with the non-destructive methods even when you're starting to take apart the inside of the device. You want to take a lot of pictures before and after this stage, and definitely during as well. And you want to document how many components can be isolated from the device without actually breaking it. At what point is it no longer possible to proceed without permanently affecting the function of this device? After that, once you reach that point, it's alright. It's time to get destructive to complete the rest of this process. So you might have to break some things out of its holders, break some chips to access other parts to get deeper and deeper within it. And that's okay. You want to be patient before that. Make sure that there's no other options at that point. So take pictures, label everything. And this is all going to help you build up a bill of materials that you put in the appendix of this report. So note all the external parts, and then note all the chips, all the components on the inside as well. So here's an example from a few years ago, that same project with the temperature monitor for the hospital. This is the part of the project when they were working on the white box engineering, and they opened up all the parts. And this is non-destructive still. You could still reassemble all of these pieces, but they pretty much laid them all out into one single picture and labeled every piece imaginable and clearly labeled them, maybe even in the caption include a brief description of their function. But this is really useful for the reader of the report at this point in your project. And this is just an example from a few years ago, and you're going to want to have something like this in your report as well. So here are some of the white box questions that you want to consider. What tools are required for disassembly and assembly? Any special tools required, power tools, anything that might be more difficult to acquire for this? Any special notes that would make the process easier the next time? What is the preferred sequence for assembly and disassembly? And you can show that with pictures. How many individual components can you reversibly disassemble the unit into without cutting, melting, or breaking anything? What are the major components of the device internally? Microcontrollers, pumps, temperature sensors, those are the major things. What specific sensors collect the inputs? What are the scientific principles of how the sensors function? So you might have to look up the part numbers and the data sheets to get an idea about how these devices actually convert these environmental signals into digital information or analog signals that are processed. You want to have some understanding of that in the report as well. Why are these sensors used? Why is one chip used rather than another one? That might be a difficult question to answer for this, but you give your best shot at it and see what you can come up with. How are the inputs processed? How are the outputs processed? How are the outputs translated to the human senses? What is the logic of the workings of the interrelated components? And what are the standard components that you'll find that aren't just specific to this device, and you might find these in a lot of other medical devices as well. Alright, so after the white box engineering phase, you'll probably be able to have an understanding of how the internal components work together at a very high level. I mean, I'm not expecting anyone to have electrical engineering backgrounds and be able to analyze circuits and do the calculations. We're not really looking for that at all in this project. Really just a high level understanding of how data flows throughout the inner circuit inside of the device. And so this is probably taken from a few years ago in the project that they had, and it was probably pulled from one of the manuals. And if you find the manual that has this information for this device you're working on, that's fine. You want to reference that, put it in your report, that's good technique. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. But if you can't find it, you want to make your own, and you're going to want to translate your understanding of the different major components on the inside to a flow diagram or to a hierarchy diagram, and show how these things are working together and how data flows throughout the circuit. You also want to note, is there any closed loop portions of this where data is flowing back into the earlier stages and it's self-checking itself to see if the machine's making a mistake and if it can self-correct? You want to be able to note that as well on a diagram like this. So after you reach the white box stage, you'll pretty much know everything that's on the outside and the inside of the device. And you'll have to put together a bill of materials that goes in the appendix of the report. And pretty much a bill of materials is like a list of all the ingredients that go into whatever you're cooking or baking. That's one way of thinking about it. It's really just all the essential components that are going to be needed to reconstruct this on your own. And that's what the reader is trying to do with your document, and what the audience members are trying to do with your presentation. So to do that, you don't have to have this electrical engineering background. Pretty much just highlight the key features. You're probably going to see a microcontroller or some embedded system inside of the device. And you can look carefully and identify the part numbers, who's the supplier of it, what material is it, how many pins does it have, what is the quantity of microcontrollers inside of it. If this shows up in an image somewhere in the report, reference that image where it appears in a visual form in some portion of the columns of the bill of material. And you want to look up the supplier and the part number, and that's usually going to give you an idea of what the cost is of that part. And you're not always going to be able to find that on your own. It might be discontinued. But if you're able to find the part price, include that as well. But if not, just put not available, and that's okay to have some blanks if you can't find the information. You want to have as much information, though, that you are able to find. And you might see hundreds of resistors and capacitors and transistors and all that inside of the circuit. But really what I'm looking for in this report is just really the most important electric components inside of it. And so note, if there's hundreds of resistors, just put one column for resistors, put an estimate on the quantity. You don't have to write the specific resistance values for all that. Maybe give a cost estimate, but really you can't find all that detailed information for that many number of components. But you want to at least list that resistors and capacitors did exist inside of the circuit. So that's what I mean by include the details, but don't go into really such minute details that it would just be impossible to get all the information. If it has push buttons, include that as well. LCD screens, sorry for the misspell there. But all these things are parts that are essential to making up the device. Alright, so moving on to the fourth phase, which is when you design an improved feature. After the reverse engineering is completed, you want to design a modification to the device that improves its function and gives it more value. And that's the part where you kind of can be really creative, and that should be the most fun part of this whole project, is that you get through all that early stage stuff about the already existing stuff, and then you translate and it kind of evolve that into something that's better than what was originally there. That's the fun part, hopefully. You want to understand the user and then add value to the device with the new feature. So maybe you want to improve the data flow. These are just some examples. Better integrate the device with the environment based on your understanding of how it's used. You want to integrate this device with other technology. Is there some roadblocks that's preventing this the information coming from this device from being shared in another way and translating into other technologies? Maybe you can find a cool feature to make that more efficient. You want to complete a 3D SolidWorks modeling of the device both before and after the new feature is designed. And then you want, for an example, do you want to modify the external casing to improve the user experience? Do you want to add handles, change the shape, make it more portable, change its dimensions, its size, the materials to make it more useful in other situations? You want to be able to model that in SolidWorks and show the before and after pictures of that. So these are some questions that you want to address when you're coming up with your new features for the device. You want to state what are the limitations of the device currently when you first get it? Who is the device intended to be used by? What improvements can be made? Will the new feature actually be useful to the user? You don't want to make a feature that you think is cool or it makes it look more flashy. You actually want to have value to the feature. You're going to have to justify that, justify the usefulness of the new feature in the report. So one feature idea is what design would make a more appealing and ergonomically correct case? So you're going to have to understand the setting that it's used in, what would make it fit into its environment in a better way than the current device. Alright, so the fifth and final phase of the project is when you write the deliverable. And I'll talk about deliverables in a lot more detail later on in this course. So if you have questions about that, ask me if I don't cover them later, but I'm really hopefully going to cover all that stuff at another time. Each item in the report should be traceable to what's in your notebooks. So that's what I meant by traceability earlier in this talk. You want to look at the report and be able to find it in the notebook. But if you look in the notebook, you won't be able to find everything in the report. It's kind of like a one-way street where a filter occurs going from the notebook to the deliverable. You always want to have more information in the notebook and then just reduce that information to a cleaner, more efficient form in the written phase of it in the deliverable. So here, just to help you visualize, the reports will write themselves with a good notebook. So if you have a good notebook, it will be able to write the deliverable on its own. So really all the hard work and most of the documentation occurs at the notebook stage, at the early portion. That's where most of the effort will have to be put in, and it will be a lot easier at the end. It'll be a lot less backtracking and things like that when you get to the deliverable stage. But you always want to be able to trace stuff that you find in the deliverable back into the notebook. So here's just some general advice about what you should and should not do for this report. I encourage you to use all the resources you can to get information about the device. So use all the internet sources, journal article searches, media information. Any outside information is definitely encouraged, and you want to have a bibliography identifying all those outside sources. You want to describe the information necessary for a non-engineering management group to understand. So be able to being able to describe your findings to a larger, more general audience is a good skill to have, and so that's one of the goals of this project as well. All right, so I talked about what you should do. This is definitely what you should not do for this project. So I encourage you to use all these outside sources, but the only source you should not use is the manufacturer or the supplier of this device. You can use the manuals and instructions that are given with it, but I don't want anyone to go to the websites or call people asking questions from the manufacturer. The whole goal of this project is to simulate that you don't have contact with those people who originally created it. You can't actually ask them direct questions. You have to do research and work on your own and fill in the holes of the missing information on your own without talking to them verbally or through emails or telephone calls and things like that. So you want to have a bill of materials, but include the most important electronic components. If there's 100 resistors, don't list all 100 of them. Just list that there were 100 of these resistors inside of the machine. So just pick the major components to describe. Alright, so when should you work on this project? So I'm going to hand the device shortly to each of the teams, and you can take this device anywhere you want, outside of campus, the classroom, the labs. You can take it wherever you want to work on this. Later on in the semester, I'll dedicate a class period to just letting the teams work together in the classroom during that time, so that they can ask me questions about specific things, and it'll help them get more prepared towards the end of this project when they have to start wrapping things up. So work on the project outside of lecture class, and definitely not during the lab time down on main campus. So this is supposed to be an out of class, out of lab project you're going to be working on your own outside of these time periods. When the class is over, I ask all the teams to return the device when they're done with this project. So the materials for project grading. So you have a team deliverable. There's going to be a rubric posted with all the details for that you're going to want to look at. I'll share that later on. There's the individual notebooks. So these are collected at the end of this project, and everyone is evaluated independently from the group deliverable. So the notebooks are definitely a graded component for everyone in the class. So after the written reports are done, there's going to be an individual peer review that's administered for all the teams. And basically that's where every team member anonymously evaluates the work and contributions from all the other team members that they worked with. And they also evaluate their own personal contributions to the team in an honest manner. And it's a chance for you to really see what the strengths and weaknesses, why or why not do you feel like you had a successful experience in the project, and things like that. And this information that you turn in online is not shared with anyone else in the class. The only person who's ever going to read it is me. And actually, I use this information to help develop some individual factors for making the individual grades for the project. But you should feel completely comfortable inputting individual peer reviews because they're anonymous and no one else reads them besides me. Alright, so I know this has been a long presentation so far, and hopefully you're not sleeping and this part will get more interesting and wake you up. This is going to be a walkthrough of some pictures from the project about 2 years ago, where they took apart I think it was a drug infusion pump that would connect to an IV line in a clinical setting and help administer drugs to a patient intravenously. And that's what this device was, and this was 2 years ago. And this is some example pictures that appeared either in presentations or in the written report that helped document their progression through the project. And this would be an example here of the black box engineering when you're just looking at the outside of the project. Here they show just other angles, side views of the device, again without having any tools touching the device at this point. This is in its original state. So you want to probably have scale bars and labels on all of these pictures. Here these examples don't include that information, but that's something that you do want to have on your reports and in your presentations. So here they start to take apart, still in the black box phase, it's just external, but right on that edge where, okay, here they're getting into the white box stuff when they're taking apart the device still in a non-destructive manner. So usually electronic parts, the PCB boards can just pop out and you can still reattach them and get the device to work. And you're going to want to be able to do that probably to maybe see, I don't know, if there's a pump or something working, maybe you want to see that working in action. And so that's why you don't want to break stuff yet. So you want to have all these pictures labeled, pretty much just the high level stuff. So on the left you see a big either microprocessor or a microcontroller, and you can see the part number. And you're going to want to look that up and use that to find out who supplied this, what's the cost, what are some of the capabilities of it. So here at the end of the project, they did 3D SolidWorks renderings, external views of it, and they did a lot of 3D snapshots of it. You're going to want to have scale bars in this as well, and you want to make it clear that this is renderings of the original device before any modifications to it have been done in terms of the new features that you come up with. So here's just another view of the still unmodified device, and maybe you're thinking this looks a lot more detailed than anything I had to do in the previous semesters, and that's definitely one of the objectives of this, is to kind of push your limits in terms of your SolidWorks and 3D modeling skills. So you really want to make this to look like the most realistic digital representation of the blood pressure monitor cuff. You really want to push your limit and see what you can come up with and make the most realistic rendering possible. So here they do actually have some of the scale bars that should be there, and this should have been in all of the pictures pretty much. So you're going to want to have those displayed in your images. So here's a picture of the inputs in terms of the display and the buttons on the original device that hasn't been touched. And they even have the company name, part number, and things like that. So it's a pretty realistic SolidWorks representation of the actual device. And finally, this is a picture of their device after they came up with the new features. It's definitely different in terms of the interface compared to the original device. And you want to have this kind of before and after snapshots in SolidWorks of before and after the new feature is designed for the device. And you want to clearly label the new features of your device when you show it. You don't want to make it ambiguous as to where the user should be looking for modifications. And maybe your modifications are not even something that you could represent visually, and it could be more information processing. And that's fine too. Maybe your before and afters won't really look different at all. In that case, you want to maybe show some block diagrams showing modifications in the data flow compared to the beginning when you first got the device, and the end of the project when it has that new feature or that new information processing method at the end. So that pretty much wraps up hopefully everything you wanted to know about this reverse engineering project. And throughout the weeks I'll still be giving updates and answering all your questions about the project. So please send me emails. I'll be trying to answer those as best as I can, and I'll be giving more question and answer documents. I'll be sending those out to the class as well to fill in any more questions that you may have about the project. But thanks for watching, and I hope this was pretty useful for you.